What are they booing about? Well, I don't know. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing, and where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks. Today we have Candy Gunther Brown. She's a professor of religious studies at Indiana University, and we're going to be talking about her new book, Debating Yoga and Mindfulness in Public Schools, Reforming Secular Education or Reestablishing Religion, ? University of North Carolina Press. And of course, we have David Forbes in Brooklyn, and so we're going to dive in. I was just thinking about when I first met you, and it was at the American Academy of Religion conference, I think, in November of 2014. When I first saw you beginning to present on these themes. And then I just saw you, about a month ago, right, in San Diego. I was on a panel with Candy, so maybe we'll talk about that later. And David was with Candy, about 2 months ago?
Just the end of November, at the Mindful Leader Summit, and we were both on stage, part of a set-up debate. And Candy was talking about religion in public schools.
Right. Well, Candy, why don't we just start out by, I'd like to learn a bit about what motivated you to write this book, what was some of the background behind it, and I think that would be a good way to start out.
Sure. Well, thank you both for having me. So I need to start a couple of books ago to give the lead up, but I'll do it quickly. So I actually started off my graduate studies many years ago now, working on mostly Christianity in America in the 19th century. And looking at the influence of evangelical Christian movements. And as I finished my first book project, I then realized I needed to move into 20th and 21st century topics, and that took me a lot more globally and made me aware of the strong interest in healing that was motivating to so many religious practices. So then I began a project on Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity. And as I was interviewing informants for that project, I was surprised as I was talking to Pentecostals about prayer for healing, how often they volunteered their love for their chiropractors. And that struck me as an interesting comment, especially since they insisted that their chiropractors were Christian. They never told me that about their medical doctors. And I knew enough about chiropractic to know that there was a metaphysical history to the practice, that there were certain tensions with the history of Christianity. So that then started me on a project looking at complementary and alternative medicine in America and the interplays across religious traditions. And so in that project, I looked not just at chiropractic, but at acupuncture, at aromatherapy, homeopathy, and yoga and mindfulness, among other practices. So that project was in press. I was on sabbatical in the UK when a couple of law professor colleagues made me aware of a developing controversy over a public school yoga program in Encinitas, San Diego County, California. And so I sent out book advertisements, basically thinking, well, maybe some of the research I've done will be helpful in kind of understanding the history and the context of what's going on. And I basically went back to my sabbatical. Well, a few months rather later, I was contacted by one of the attorneys involved in that developing controversy, and he asked me to explain to the courts what is religion, what is yoga, what's the connection between these things. And so I ended up agreeing to write a declaration for that, and to testify. Ended up testifying for 6 hours in that trial, fully expecting that it would be an in and out sort of thing. I would fly in, do what I saw as just a service of informing the public more about the history and context of religion, which is something I've done in a lot of kinds of community presentations. And then I'd fly back and I'd move on to my next research project. That didn't happen because I basically realized that this was so much more complicated and so much more fascinating than I'd ever imagined. I shared the assumption of many people, I think, that when public schools put programs like yoga, mindfulness, other kinds of character, health, wellness programs in schools, they're going to be secular versions of those practices. I had no idea what very interesting kinds of programs were being developed, not only in Encinitas, but then in a variety of programs across the country. And so that then was the origin of this project.
Right. And so you served as an expert witness in Encinitas, and several other cases, I would imagine, came up since then.
Yeah, so the Encinitas case, which was over an Ashtanga yoga program in the Encinitas Union School District, that became an opportunity for me to then examine a lot of other programs and to serve as an expert witness in other cases. And so there were a couple of cases in Pennsylvania. One of them was involving pranic healing and arhatic yoga and super brain yoga as the foundation for a charter school. Another involved Waldorf methods as the foundation for a charter school and connections there to anthroposophy. And then I was asked to consult in a controversy over mindfulness meditation in Massachusetts. And I actually talked to both the developers of the program and the people who were concerned about that program. So I've had chances to work talking with parents who are concerned about programs, school districts who have their own concerns, and with the developers of programs, and have talked to people from a wide variety of perspectives and have learned a lot from their experiences and their take on what's going on in these programs.
Yes, and in the beginning of your book, in the introduction, and this is something I think that is so complex, so nuanced, and so contested. The whole question of how to define or defining religion versus secularity, or what's religious, what's secular. And I think you opened the book with those sort of questions, and I'm wondering. We could probably talk for 2 hours just on this theme.
And, I'm sure we could.
So what's your basic take on this whole debate in terms of, maybe in the context with your book, of course, but in terms of differentiating, how do you define secular? What's secular or secularity versus religious?
Yeah, so as you start off, these are really complex and really interrelated concepts, and I don't think that there is one definitive way of isolating or kind of finding an essence or an inherent kind of property that makes something secular or religious. What's interesting is if you trace back where you get the term secular, it actually develops in Roman Catholic canon law. and there were secular priests as well as religious priests. And it was the secular priests who went into the world to be involved in the ordinary affairs of life, as opposed to being restricted to the cloister. And the argument was that they'd be more effective in conveying religious influences because they were secular. So secular historically could mean that you're involved in the world versus kind of set apart in your own religious area. It could mean pertaining to affairs of this world versus another world. A lot of times people assume that you can put things into a box so that if they're secular, then they're not religious. And often, if they're scientific, then they're secular, then they're not religious. But often these are actually very interacting kinds of categories. And a practice can have secular effects, for instance, effects on health, but also can exert religious influences, can communicate metaphysical assumptions about the nature of the self and of the world. So I don't see there as being a neat binary between things either being secular or religious. And actually, what the book does is it plays out how you could interpret both yoga and mindfulness as, in some senses, being both of those things. They do. These practices are enacted in kind of everyday spaces, hospitals, schools, concerned with everyday problems, sickness, stress, anxiety. But there are these kinds of metaphysical implications often, and spiritual and religious experiences that participants will claim, even from the nominally secular versions of the practices.
I think much of the wisdom of your book is that you don't try to answer that question or define them. You make that point that they are intertwined and interact, and it becomes another issue that I'm sure you'll talk about later.
Exactly. Well, and none of us are kind of out of this game, right? Everyone's got a kind of stake in the question of what's secular or religious. And so coming up with an objective, unbiased definition, I think that's actually really a problematic thing to try and claim one's done. Now, people do have to make calls in particular cases. For instance, for establishment clause purposes, like interpreting the First Amendment, can a program be taught in a school? Someone's got to make the judgment call whether this is going to be classified as religious for those legal purposes. Now, is that going to be a definitive definition that gets at everyone's experiences? I don't think that's possible. But someone is going to do defining work. And what I think as scholars we can do is try and add some of that nuance and make participants in what are often very contested situations aware of other ways of interpreting the practices that are at stake.
Yeah, I think that leads right into your first chapter, because you mentioned the establishment clause, and some people might not know exactly what that pertains to. Could you just give us a synopsis of?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the Constitution's First Amendment has protections of freedom of speech and the press and of religion. And there are two prongs to the religion clauses. One is that there's a protection against government establishing religion, thus the Establishment Clause, but also a protection of the free exercise of religion. And so in public school contexts, both are protected by the courts. That government can't be endorsing particular religions or religion kind of over non-religion, but also needs to provide protection to the exercise of religion by various individuals or groups.
Mm-hmm. And you start out, this chapter was very interesting in terms of the early history of public education or public schools. I think you sort of located the beginning as far back as 1642. But it might be good to talk a little bit about this idea of moral education, and because that was very fundamental to our history, our public school history, in terms of teaching moral codes and character codes and all that.
Sure. Well, when even the Massachusetts Bay colonists started with schools, there was a worry among leaders that parents, in a sense, couldn't be trusted necessarily with all of the moral instruction of their children. So schools were established not only to teach practical skills like reading and writing, but also to instill morality and ethics, and initially with a very Protestant Christian religious base. And really, for the first 300 years of public education, Christianity was pretty thoroughly established in the public school system, and many would argue that it's still more established than they would like to see. It was really only in the middle of the 20th century, though, that the Supreme Court started to intervene and to say that there were some lines that were being crossed, particularly with practices like prayer and devotional Bible reading, where schools, as agents of the state, were advancing not just moral character, but Christian practices and values. And partly what's going on here is there's this way in which schools have been idealized as moral guardians, and a lot of weight, more, I think, than schools could possibly carry. But a lot of weight has been given to their being responsible for developing morality and ethics. And so when the courts came in and said, well, prayer and Bible reading don't have a place in the schools, beginning in the 1960s, there was a kind of floundering by school leaders who had been relying on the Bible for moral character to say, well, where are we going to get these teachings from? And so part of the appeal of yoga and mindfulness has been as a non-religious way of getting the same kinds of moral and ethical bearings that schools had relied upon Christian practices to instill before these court rulings.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I remember reading something about a case where students or children could have moments of silence, but didn't the court intervene in that as well? Or they're requiring some sort of opt-out clause, or?
So there's a couple of issues there. In terms of moments of silence, there have been several court rulings, and the basic stance of the courts even today is that a few seconds, a minute or so of moments of silence are permissible constitutionally, provided that there isn't an encouragement to do something in particular with that silence. So to pray or to meditate in a particular way. And that's really separate from the question of opt-out clauses. The courts have basically found that an opt-out clause doesn't do any good constitutionally, because the problem with classroom prayer is that there is a subtle coercive pressure. Even if children are not required to pray, there's teacher authority, there's peer pressure, there's a kind of implication that we who are praying includes the audience in that prayer. So even if there's an opt-out clause, if it's unconstitutional without the clause, it's unconstitutional with the clause. And so even today, there are many public schools that have moments of silence, and courts don't intervene except when there is direction given as to what you're supposed to do during that time.
Right. Yeah, we'll get into that later because I think that issue comes up in terms of the mindfulness programs and yoga programs in public schools as well.
Yeah, and especially with transcendental meditation.
Yes, yes. A key legal case is the Malnick versus Yogi, I think, and you cite Arlen Adams. And why is that important? Can you just talk about the significance of that particular ruling?
Yeah, so this was a New Jersey federal case, went to a federal appellate court, and it involved an elective high school course on transcendental meditation. And the courts found that it was a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, even though the promoters of the TM program insisted that this was science, it wasn't religion. The court found that for legal purposes, it counted as religion. And so the significance then of a concurring opinion by Arlen Adams, which gave more of a rationale for why reach that decision that this is religion as opposed to secular, is this really has become a kind of defining point or a set of legal indicia for how the courts determine whether something is religious when there's dispute over that. And there was another federal appellate court that involved a church of marijuana afterwards, and where someone insisted this was religion, and the court said, no, that doesn't count as religion. And so between these two cases, we get these, what I kind of give shorthand as the Malnack-Myers indicia of religion. And so, first of all, it basically turns into five kinds of prongs to this. So first of all is the question of whether there are ultimate concerns at stake, kind of the big problems of life. Secondly, is it a comprehensive system? It's not just kind of an isolated teaching. Third, are there kind of surface signs of religion that you can find analogies in recognized religions, for instance, a founder or texts or dietary practices, holidays. Fourth, whether there are metaphysical ideas. And then fifth, whether there are moral and ethical teachings. And so this set of standards has been quite widely applied by courts to determine whether questionable practices are religious for legal purposes.
Yeah, that was very interesting. I looked at those, and I was really stunned when I looked at transcendental meditation (TM) in these cases. The popularity of TM just skyrocketed from the 70s. And it's very interesting, I think, the history of how TM also tried to rebrand itself by conducting pseudoscientific studies, but to gain scientific legitimacy. And so TM was rebranded as Quiet Time. And the David Lynch Foundation, which has been providing tremendous amount of money to public schools to bring in not TM, but Quiet Time into public schools. But what really stunned me was I didn't realize that even in public schools, I don't know if this is true, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that they still do the initiation ceremony, the puja.
They still do, and on campus. And it's the Sanskrit chants involved are invocations of deities. There is bowing, there are offerings, there's a secret mantra that's delivered that, according to the founder of TM, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, invokes the names and the properties of personal gods. And there are full-time site kind of managers that are trained by the TM organization that are on campus, meeting with students individually. And as you say, there are huge amounts of money and a lot of pressure often being placed on schools to have these programs and to change the structure of the school day to make room for 15 or 20 minutes of meditation at the beginning and the end of every school day. So just a large amount of instructional time that is lost from the day and dedicated to the practice.
As a brief example, in New York City here, and recently the David Lynch Foundation has been attempting to make a foray into some of the schools here in New York City, and it's been met with those kind of arguments of opposition that it's really it has a religious component, and there's been pushback against that.
I've seen even cases where the David Lynch Foundation has lawyers that actually sends very threatening letters to people that are challenging it. It's quite interesting. But you mentioned that there was a law review article that they still kind of came away saying it was secular because the brochures said it was secular, and I found that quite stunning.
Well, I think it is stunning because the author of the article, as well as I could understand what was happening in the article, he basically just took the promotional brochures at face value. Mentioned that there was controversy over whether the mantras had religious meaning, and then cited as the one source in support of that claim a scholar who actually wrote a quite long, thorough book and multiple books that explained how the mantra does have religious significance. So there's not a semantic meaning, but there definitely are kind of religious meanings because the sense is that the mantra brings the divine presence of the deity invoked. And so there was another law review article that was cited by Adams in his concurring opinion, which raised real questions about whether even just teaching the mantras without teaching the ideas of the science of creative intelligence, whether it's possible to do that without really encouraging the entire belief system. Because once you have a positive experience with that mantra, it's going to become an invitation to find more out about that belief system. So in my take on it, that law review article really got to the core issues more than this more recent article that you're referencing.
Yeah, and it's very interesting how if you look at the rhetorical strategy, I guess you could call it that. First of all, TM was very explicitly led by Maharishi Yogi. The Beatles made it quite popular. But it's interesting how over time there's the cloaking and the code switching, as you refer to it, in terms of rebranding it under a scientific veneer. And I think we see almost the same sort of trajectory in mindfulness in education. The rhetorical tactics sound, for example, if we look at Goldie Hawn's Mind Up program, the rhetorical tactics sound awfully similar to Quiet Time. Would you agree with that? Do you see parallels?
I do see a parallel in these. And and it's partly a matter of recognizing what's going to give cultural legitimacy to a practice. And it's the language of science coupled with the language of spirituality that makes products sell in our current culture. And so Goldie Hawn and others have realized this. And so as she talks about the program, she talks about it differently when she's talking to Buddhist sympathizers or when she's talking to kind of presumably secular audiences. And there's this quite intentional explicitly so effort to replace terms like Buddhism, terms like meditation with terms like core practice and neuroscience, and to kind of talk about specific brain anatomy, and to use language that's going to give a kind of legitimacy to the program.
Yeah, and also the missionary sort of impetus that many of these programs have. I think especially with Goldie Hawn's, she says something like, "We got to get this into every school, and we'll bring Buddhist meditation into the classroom, but we'll use a script, core practices, or whatever phrase she uses." But I find it kind of interesting that they're kind of appealing to neuroscience, but the neuroscience, especially when it comes, well, for adults even, it's so thin. I mean, the contemplative neuroscientist in the academic articles will say our knowledge of meditation and mindfulness from a neuroscience perspective is trivial. They'll admit that, but then it's kind of waved as a flag by people like Goldie Hawn and many others.
And one of the issues that Candy brings up in your book is this whole notion of neuroplasticity. That becomes like its own mantra. It becomes, well, mindfulness leads to neuroplasticity, where you can change the brain. It changes the brain, and then the big myth about that is that many things change the brain. Many activities that children can engage in, or that we all can engage in, and so that becomes a big myth.
Right. Well, exactly. Right. If you exercise, you eat a healthy lunch, you listen to music or play music, or you do math problems. As you say, all of these things will have these kind of neuroplasticity effects. And but this is where, if you say that it's neuroscience, then it's in the science, the secular bucket, rather than the religion bucket. And that ends up being an argument for the permissibility in schools. But then, I mean, also, as you mentioned, there is this kind of missionary sense to it. The sense everyone desperately needs mindfulness. Schools are in crisis. Everyone is stressed and anxious. And this is going to fix all of the structural problems and all of the racism and all of the violence and all of the economic disparities. It becomes like this, we have to get this absolutely mandated in schools, to use Goldie Hawn's language, because there's such a desperate need for this.
Yeah. So in this particular chapter, chapter 9 in your book, Mindfulness in Education, you take a look at you take a look at the Mind Up program. You take a look at the Mindful Schools program in Oakland and Calmer Choice, but there's similarities across all of them. And one of the interesting things that I think you really documented is just how much backstage behavior is explicitly Buddhist. Either the teachers, the founders of these programs, the sponsors, the people on advisory boards, whatever it may be, it's there, as plain as day. Right. And what I was really enjoying reading how I don't know exactly what triggered it, but it seems like many of the proponents of mindfulness in education, for example, I think you mentioned Amy Saltzman, kind of saw a red flag coming, or at least saw that, we better regroup and find ways to make sure that we don't cross the line. Can you talk about that? What you discovered there?
Right. Well, and I mean, we saw the beginnings of this even with Kabat-Zinn and kind of talking about mindfulness-based stress reduction. So, I mean, he recognized that there had to be some kind of secular reframing. But what we've seen is a new kind of iteration, or kind of taking it to another level of realizing it's important to not only subtract just some of the language, but also some of the gestures and some of the objects. And so now in these efforts to what advocates will call ensure secularity, there's a removing of the so-called Tibetan singing bowls. There's an avoidance of some of the mudras and some of the more kind of recognized gestures that go with practices, because there have been a lot of conversations where promoters of mindfulness in education have realized, people are going to be complaining about this. And then as the Calmer Choice controversy kind of came to a head in 2016, there's more talk about, well, what can we do to change how we've been implementing these programs so that we don't have a lawsuit on our hands?
Yeah, I actually remember getting a hold of and reading that Calmer Choice. There was a 24-page legal memorandum. It was very well done. And what I found kind of funny was how they were scrubbing their websites when they realized that the courts may be taking a closer look.
Yeah, well, it's actually even more interesting than that, because if you use this handy tool, the Wayback Machine or Internet Archives, you can find different versions of websites over time. And so you can find, for instance, references to Jon Kabat-Zinn and MBSR as crucial training for Calmer Choice. Then they disappear. And then the next part is, once the legal controversy fizzled, they reappeared and you get Kabat-Zinn back. And so it's not even a static scrubbing, but it's a question of when we're being scrutinized, we're going to be more careful. But then if it's safe, we can put some of the advertising tools back on, because if you claim an affiliation with MBSR or Kabat-Zinn, you're going to have more attention than if you're a standalone program.
Yeah. You mentioned a friend of mine in the book, Brooke Dodson Lavelle, and there was some mention that she actually was kind of monitoring an online discussion of the Mindfulness and Education Network. And let's see if I could find it. And basically, she criticized them for suggesting that teachers only need to, quote, employ a secular rhetoric to gain access into educational institutions. And once one's foot is in the door, so to speak, one is then free to teach whatever Buddhist teachings they deem appropriate. And the so-called Trojan horse, right? Is that basically what that amounts to?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, she's done wonderful research on this and wrote just a terrific dissertation that makes a lot of the same kinds of arguments about the disingenuousness of some of the leaders of these movements, and where you do see references, not in the curriculum necessarily, but in terms of these online kind of discussions of what you're doing in the classroom, or insider documents that explain how, even though MBSR never talks about Buddhism, here's how systematically all the different elements of Buddhism are being communicated. So you see that in the education programs, you see that in the more general programs, at least with the prominent leaders. And this is where I don't want to overgeneralize here, because I think that especially when we're now starting to talk about second, third generation and beyond, there are a lot of people who have just had personally beneficial experiences with mindfulness. They're persuaded by the scientific evidence, however good or bad that may be. And they may not even really know about the Buddhist foundations of programs. And so they've so internalized assumptions about self and world that they just seem self-evidently good, true, universal. So I don't know that, so I wouldn't want to say that everyone who's teaching mindfulness in education is consciously employing stealth Buddhism. I think that the programs do instill a lot of assumptions that are derived from Buddhist teachings, but these aren't necessarily recognized even by the people who are promoting these teachings.
Yeah, no, I could see that. There's another point you make in this chapter where I think Patricia Jennings, you bring her up, who is written, I think, a best-selling book on training teachers in mindfulness. And she, her reference point for determining whether something is secular or not is just by looking up a dictionary definition.
Right. Yeah, it's dictionary.com. And it's basically, it's beliefs about a deity. And I mean, it's a very, she's not trained in religious studies. And so I think that what's missing in a lot of the analyses, not just hers, is an understanding that religion is more than belief statements.
Yeah, and I think this is what your book really gets at, is you're focusing on the effects of practices, right?
Yeah.
And practices, the way practices are seen, from the perspective of mindfulness and education proponents, is that they're religiously neutral because they're just techniques, right?
Right. Right. And this is Jennings's argument where it's like, well, we've got choral reading. And so you just subtract out the Christian content, you make it secular. Well, mindfulness, that's also a practice. And so it's inherently secular of its own. And so as long as you're not kind of talking about the beliefs that go with it, the practice itself is secular. And yet, even with a lot of the mindfulness and education leaders, there also is an assumption that the practices are transformative. And so you see both of these languages being deployed sometimes by the same individuals, that it's neutral or that it's transformative. All you have to do is get someone on a cushion or just even get them sitting in their seat in the classroom and being mindful for a few minutes. And that is going to fundamentally change how they see reality.
I think also though, you make a couple of crucial points in the book that the mindfulness advocates talk about it as a way of life. I mean, they don't even try to avoid that. There's a lot of admission of that. And the other complicated point that you make is, or a point that complicates things, is that it's an embodied, along with yoga, they're embodied practices. And then those do stir up all these other qualities that are hard to sort out.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the thing about embodied practice, and especially the kinds of very conscious practices that we're talking about here, where there's a calling attention to sensory experience. And so you get heightened awareness and then reinterpret those experiences because sensations are not self-interpreting. And so this is a point you make, David, actually, that there's this kind of myth of the given that there's somehow just this transparent reality and you just kind of wake up, see things as they are, but there's always interpretation that goes on here. And there's an interpretive lens that's being provided by the teachers, by the curriculum. And then there's these associations at large in the culture where if you Google the term mindfulness, you're not just going to find non-judgmental awareness of the present moment. No, you're going to find kind of a much more kind of elaborate contextual understanding. And so there's this way in which this set of interacting phenomena shapes perception and interpretation of experience. And the embodiedness of the practice is so important to how this works.
one of the practices in particular, I think, that we haven't mentioned, and it's the way it's been reframed, is the Buddhist practice of loving kindness. Can you say more about that and what you found?
So mindful schools, for example, they relabel the practice as heartfulness. Other groups will call it something like they'll talk about sending good thoughts or kindness, or, I mean, there's various ways to kind of like come up with secular language for it, friendly wishes. But it's actually a very similar kind of script that children are being asked to recite. May you be happy, may you be healthy, may you be peaceful. And there are videos of children in classrooms being led in the practices, and they're closing their eyes, they're placing their palms together, and they're kind of sending out these good thoughts. And teachers are saying, and you can send them not just to your classmates who are sick, but even those who have already died, in a way that suggests that there is this connection, even metaphysically, across distance, across the lines between the living and the dead. And that's in even kindergarten classrooms.
Let me be a little devil's advocate just for a brief moment, because this is the kind of thing I get too. People say, well, what's the harm? What's the harm in teaching kindness to children? I kind of go back to my memory when I was in elementary school, and I remember we used to send Valentine cards to people in the classroom. We would send little kind notes, and I think Valentine is a saint, isn't it? But anyway, it seems very benign on the surface. So, what is the underlying issue here that you're trying to point to?
Yeah, well, and it would be perverse to say, no, we shouldn't be kind or compassionate, right? That's not my. But really, where I land on this is with respect for cultural and religious diversity, for transparency and voluntarism in being able to give informed consent. Not everyone in that classroom is going to feel comfortable with that manner of communicating loving kindness, or even that particular definition of what it is, what the sources are, what the goals are of the practice. And so if the children and the parents want that, then absolutely there's value in providing opportunities for this and many other kinds of programs and practices. But where the problems emerge is where there's a sense, and there are a number of parents, children from various states in the U.S., from Canada, from other parts of the world, where for them, this feels like a violation of religious conscience. It feels like religious coercion. They feel like they don't know what they're being asked to do until they've already done it. I think of an instance of a Virginia father who emailed me out of the blue. This happens a fair amount now, saying that his young daughter felt like she had just violated the central tenets of her religion because she'd started coloring a mandala and was told halfway through what she was being asked to do. This was like an existential crisis for her. There are teachers who have contacted me from California and from British Columbia who have lost their classrooms because they wouldn't teach mindfulness in the classroom. One of them because it threw her into kind of PTSD reactions, and the other one who was worried about the effects, the possible adverse effects on the students in our classroom. So that's where the problems emerge, is when it becomes religiously coercive. And this is where the reasoning of the Supreme Court is relevant, in that even opting out of a teacher saying the Lord's Prayer in the classroom or reading a Bible verse, that's subtly coercive at the least. And so even if you're told, well, you can sit quietly, you can read a book, you can take a nap, you can just watch what we're doing in this mindfulness exercise, there's this way in which peer pressure and teacher authority can exert a kind of pressure to participate when the student may not find it valuable, or even may find that it conflicts with fundamental convictions that they have for religious or non-religious reasons of just kind of who they've defined themselves to be and what their goals and their values are.
Yeah, I think that's particularly true when these programs are kind of aimed to create like a school-wide culture of.
And that's exactly it, right? I mean, where you talk about how it's not just the practice, it's the way of life, which is why the teachers need to have a personal practice. They need to go on retreats. They need to have mentors. And often the retreats are at Buddhist centers. The mentors are long-term Buddhist meditators. It's this way of life. And it is a culture that goes beyond the boundaries of a classroom activity. And this is where yoga is at least usually contained within a PE class. Mindfulness, that's all day long. It may be 3 short segments at different times during the day. It may be an English class or math class. And so even if someone has opted out of the class, there may be posters on the wall. There may be loudspeaker announcements where it's hard to opt out without actually opting out of the entire school system.
I don't know if this is a good time for you to talk about the idea of opting in as one of your suggestions.
Yeah, well, this is basically where I land, is to recommend a voluntary opt-in model of informed consent. So be transparent about what the teachings are, not only what the ancient history is, but what are the ongoing associations, what are the sources of why this particular set of values to emphasize, right? I mean, loving kindness isn't the only value that you can teach. Why privilege this one, right? Where does that come from? Where are the texts? Where are the teachings? What are the associations that come with it? So transparency and voluntarism, which I think practically is easiest, at least if it's a before school or an after school or a lunchtime program, because as we saw with the transcendental meditation case in New Jersey, even though that was an elective class, even though it was high school students who aren't as young and impressionable as, say, kindergartners, there's still a kind of endorsement that comes from the government when it's an offering by the school. And so that if you have this kind of opt-in model, you don't play on herd instincts, and you have to actually make a choice to get into the program. Whereas otherwise, it's easy to, if you haven't given it a lot of thought and it hasn't been advertised to you that, this may not actually gel with what your goals and values are, you may just kind of go along with the program and then realize partway in that this wasn't what you thought you were signing on for in the outset. So to me, I think this alleviates a lot of the issues that are present in many of the current school programs.
So what about the science?
Yeah. So, the science, as you've suggested, there are a lot of claims about the just overwhelming scientific evidence in favor of mindfulness and other programs. If you look at systematic reviews, the evidence is a lot weaker than what's presented. The higher the quality of the studies, the lower the effects are. Many of the studies are not randomized controlled trials. There are not active control groups. A lot of times it's researchers who have personal allegiances to the practices who are involved in administering and evaluating the program. So there's a lot of kind of potential for bias in how the results are interpreted even. And what gets underreported in the literature are challenging or adverse effects. And this is where a lot of the really terrific research being led by Brown University researchers like Jared Lindell and Willoughby Britton has been so important in that mindfulness is advertised as stress reduction. It actually can increase stress and anxiety and depression. Yeah, and even suicidality and psychosis, right? Some actually quite frightening kinds of symptoms. That doesn't get disclosed, and contraindications are often not screened for. And this is where at least the Center for Mindfulness does, which is Kabat-Zinn's kind of the organization he founded. At least they screen for contraindications, but a lot of these school programs don't. They don't want students to have to kind of single themselves out to say, oh yeah, I've actually got a history of trauma and abuse. But those might actually be the students who are most at risk of reliving traumatic memories when they're going through the practice, or they may have PTSD or some kind of underlying social anxiety, depression, psychosis. Those contraindications really need to be screened for as well.
And that's another point about you're arguing for the need for transparency, that many of the programs in schools do not explicitly describe the risks that are potentially involved.
Exactly, right? I mean, it's both kind of the religious affiliations, but it's also being aware of alternatives like aerobic exercise or taking a nap, which can be just as beneficial, realizing that, you may self-report that you feel less stressed, but your cortisol levels may actually show that you're more stressed, because self-report data isn't the most reliable kind of data. And then there's all the issues of potentials for cultural appropriation when especially wealthy white Americans are giving their own interpretation of what the essence of a practice is, and then saying that the people who most need it are especially Black and brown students of color, and especially boys of color, who get singled out as somehow having less self-regulatory capacities and need to have these then taught to them by the promoter of the program. So there's a lot of reasons to be careful here in terms of both the transparency and the voluntarism, and not pressuring students to participate.
Yeah, I think you just brought up a point about hegemony, and you cite someone, I can't remember the name, but I never heard the term virtual Orientalism.
This is Jane Iwamura. Yeah,
and the racialization, and just this whole cultural imperialism, the white savior syndrome. Can you talk? You already kind of alluded to it, but
yeah. Well, I mean, one of the points that Iwamura makes so importantly is that it's the positive Orientalist stereotypes that Asians are somehow wiser and more spiritual. That's what gets unchallenged, and so it can seem, like we'll take and we'll reinterpret this practice, but in a way that may be quite distorting and devaluing, and even can kind of make money change hands in a way that originators of practices don't have control over their own practices. But then when those practices are then imposed on students who are seen as lacking those qualities that are being kind of stereotyped as being intrinsically Asian, it's just a whole constellation of insensitivities to individual difference and to the complexity of culture.
I was really taken aback too. When I think it was a program in the UK, they even said that these practices are civilizing.
Oh yeah, they use the term civilizing, and there have been multiple proponents who talk about getting rid of the cultural baggage of Asian Buddhism. This is their language, right? The promoter's language.
And what I liked was her notion of dual racialization, that it's not only critical of disrespectful of Asian culture, but that it's, as you said earlier, it's imposed on so-called inner city or poor populations who apparently don't have the belief is they don't have self-regulation or.
Yeah, that's another one of their terms, is that they're more at risk of acting out
at
somehow.
risk, so to speak.
Yeah, it's this dual sword, right?
Yeah, and doesn't the language that this is universal, doesn't that play into this whole thing?
Yeah, well, and that's where your reference to hegemony comes into play, because what's going on there is it's the wealthier, socially powerful groups who have their own set of ideals and values that then they kind of say are universal as if they apply to all of society, when really it's actually a very Protestant influenced middle class, generally Euro-American kind of set of values. And I mean, this kind of plays into some of the issues of neoliberalism that both of you have been kind of astute to point out.
Yeah, in the last part of your book, the conclusion, you provide a really detailed explication and list of recommendations, opt-in recommendations, detailed best practices. I would really recommend anyone to look at that. I would like to end just by asking you, what's been the response to your book among different groups, academics, parents, mindfulness teachers? I'm just curious what's been the response.
Yeah, I've actually been really grateful for the overwhelmingly open, receptive response that I've gotten from program leaders, even who have, some of whom have thanked me for calling attention to important ethical issues, because I think I think especially my sense is that those who have been influenced by Buddhist values who I've talked to have such a high value on honest speech and not doing harm and the ethics of this, that there's been a real openness. Now, there have been a couple of angry people that have talked to me. But for the most part, I've been, as I say, glad that there's been a real receptivity to listen to what I have to say. And I've certainly learned so much from the many people that I've talked to, parents, school districts, superintendents, and mindfulness and yoga program leaders who are giving a lot of thought. And I think that we're seeing some really positive moves towards kind of rethinking how can these ethical issues be addressed to offer benefits of programs without the potential for coercion or for harms that aren't being disclosed as a risk that goes along with the practices.
And looking forward, do you have any future projects that you're thinking about, or are you taking a break after writing a book like this?
Well, I just finished writing a draft of an article on what I described earlier as the so-called Tibetan singing bowls, which sneak peek, if you haven't come across this, probably not ever from Tibet, and not ancient. They were popularized in the 1970s, so it's actually quite an interesting phenomenon how they've become so central and now have been seen as a central controversy point, right? That the controversy is, we need to now remove this religious symbol that never actually was a religious symbol until like the 1970s. So I'm toying. Well, I'm more than toying, but longer term next project, I think I want to look at cosmologies and demonologies in a comparative Christian Buddhist framework, and assumptions about kind of the nature of the real and what entities exist, and Western kinds of ideas of what's superstitious, and yet fascination with the metaphysical that persists despite the claim that now America is not superstitious. So demons, that's the next book project.
Wow. Well, great. Well, thank you for being on our podcast. I really enjoyed this interview.
Yeah, well, likewise. Thank you both, and I hope I get to see you both sometime soon.
Very much. Thank you, Candy.
Okay. We've been speaking with Candy Gunther Brown. She earned her bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees at Harvard University. She is currently professor of religious studies at Indiana University and a historian and ethnographer of religion and culture. She's the author of 5 books. The most recent book is what we discussed in this episode, Debating Yoga and Mindfulness in Public Schools, Reforming Secular Education or Reestablishing Religion, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2019. Her previous book was called The Healing Gods, Complementary and Alternative Medicine in Christian America, published by Oxford University Press in 2013. Previously to that, she published Testing Prayer, Science and Healing, Harvard University Press, and several other books. We'd like to thank you for listening to the Mindful Cranks. We really appreciate your support and interest, and it would really be helpful if you could leave us a review on iTunes. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. You can find our show notes on our webpage, www.mindfulcranks.com. We also now have a Patreon page, and if you would like to support our podcast, please consider making a small donation to help cover our production cost. Go to www.patreon.com/mindfulcranks. Again, thank you for listening.